All right. Yeah, we have a good number of people up now. So let's get to your book.
Yeah.
Shift, and I'm sure you didn't know that all this was going to happen, and the book seems so appropriate for this particular time.
Yeah,
All
I
right,
had no idea.
so appropriate for this particular point in time. And the first thing I would like to ask you is, what inspired you to write this book, Shift?
Well, so people ask me that question, I guess, and that's a good one. It wasn't a moment in time recently. I actually had this book inside of me since I was 22 years old.
Wow.
What most people don't know is that I pastored a church at the age of 21 while I was in college. So I got a church together with 5 people, Pastor. I was 21, and all of the members were at least 72 years and older. So, so I remember one day, this is God's honest truth. I remember one day preaching, and all 5 of them was asleep while I was preaching. And so I called my pastor and I said, I must not be doing a great job because 5 people came to church today and all 5 of them were asleep. And he said, tell me a little about the members. I said, sister this, brother that. And I told him how old they all were. He said, son, you need to understand that if everybody in your church is 72 years old and older, he says, they're not asleep, they're just drowsy from the medication. And so I just felt better about myself from that day going forward. But while I was in college, I was playing basketball. And my college coach brought me into an office one day and he said, you have a great shot at playing professional basketball, but there is a problem. And I said, what's the problem? He said, the problem is you're dedicating too much time to basketball and not enough time to your craft, or too much time to preaching and not but basketball, but you can't keep doing both. So he said, you're going to have to make a decision. And I told him that day that my decision was to play professional basketball and that I would preach for God after I was done playing basketball. That was at 4:30 in the afternoon. By 8:30 that evening, I was on a stretcher on my way to the hospital because I had torn every ligament in my left knee. And that is when the shift started. And that's when I started to write the book. And it's in the first few chapters that God shifted my knee. See, when you tear an ACL, it's because the knee joints tear. So God shifted my knee to shift my mind. And that's why I learned that God will shift you in the area that you care about so he can shape you in the area that he cares about.
Wow. 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 That's powerful. All right. So the second question I'm going to ask is, shifting represents differently to everyone. All right. I mean, to some people, it could be like you gave an experience now about your dream, which was to play the NBA. Some people may have maybe lost a dream job. Their career got terminated. And particularly when we're going through this pandemic crisis here, which will throw up a lot of things into the lives of people. So what does shifting really represent? All right, for you, what does it really mean?
And I love the question because people ask me that, and I want them to understand that there is actually a difference between shifting and drifting. Just because you're moving doesn't mean that you're shifting. Just because you left one relationship and got in another one, it doesn't mean you shifted, because you probably got it in one that was just like the last one, unless a shift took place. So here in America, Pastor, yesterday, April 4th, marked the day that Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated here in Tennessee. Yeah. So that happened 52 years ago. What most people don't know is that was not the first assassination attempt on Martin Luther King's life. There was actually an earlier attempt by a lady whose last name is Curry. Her first name Azola, last name Curry. Martin Luther King was in Harlem at a bookstore signing a book that he had written called Strides to Freedom. And this lady walks up to him and she says, "Are you Martin Luther King?" And he says, "Yes." And she took out a metal knife or a box cutter or letter opener and stabbed Martin Luther King in the chest. So a lot of people don't know about that first assassination attempt. And she stabbed him in the chest, and he went to the hospital, and the doctor told him, they said to him, that the blade was touching the aorta in his heart. And if he had sneezed, it would have pierced his aorta and he would have drowned in his own blood. Now, when I look at that, I think about something amazing, that whenever we sneeze, if everybody who's watching right now, I dare you to just pretend like you sneeze. This is how we always sneeze. It takes everything in your body to sneeze, because you can't be still and sneeze. You have to shift your position. If he would have sneezed, that blade would have shifted and it would have pierced his heart, and he would have drowned in his own blood. And I tell people all the time, be careful when you ask God for a shift, because you could drown. You could drown. Things have to move. You don't know what's going to be pierced when you shift. You don't know what you have to lose. Everybody says, Lord, I want to shift. But did you know that shifting will cost you your marriage? Lord, I want to shift. But what if it cost you your job? Lord, I want to shift. But what if it cost you your ministry? There's a pastor here in Houston, Texas. His name is Dr. Ivy Hilliard. 30,000 members at the apex of his ministry. He goes back and tells the story how he grew up as a Baptist preacher, and then the Lord moved him to Word of Faith. And he had all of these members. And when he went from Word of Faith, from Baptist to Word of Faith, his church shrunk before it grew. It's like a bow and arrow. You have to be pulled back in order to go forward. So when you ask God for that shift, you better be ready for a shaking. You better be ready for, sometimes you have to lose things, as in Martin Luther King's case. If he would have sneezed, it would have caused him to drown in his own blood. Shifts are painful, but they are, and they're rewardful, but Pastor, they're also costly.
Wow. Wow. All right, could you share a story with us on where you where you had to choose a shift from your own background there?
Yeah, I will tell you, and it's a vulnerable moment for me, and only a few people in the world know about it. And for all of those of you all who are listening, Pastor Poju and I have like a real relationship. We didn't just get on live today. We periodically text each other and check on each other, and we are thousands and thousands and thousands of miles away from each other. And I remember, Pastor, one day you called me, and this is when I had to make a decision. As you know, I went through a separation and divorce last year, and it was one of the most painful moments of my life. And when I came to your church, you had no idea what was going on. But for those of y'all who are listening, this will show you the measure of a man. Pastor called me and asked me to come and preach for a conference because there was a mix-up in our administration. And Pastor, do you remember you said, I know it's short notice, but would you come? And yeah. Pastor sent me that invitation. And guys, I only had 48 hours to spare. And I had this entire book launch and all of this stuff that was set up. But I moved it and got on the plane, and I flew to Lagos for 48 hours. Remember that, Pastor?
That's true. Yeah.
I had to shift everything to make it because I had lost the most important relationship I had. And so I was in a season where I was trying to make sure that I maintained every one of the relationships I had left. And you were one of those people who had been a constant, where I had found security, where I had found strength. And making it through that was the biggest shift of my life. I was scared to death. I thought that I would lose the church. I thought that I would lose my mind. I thought that I would lose my friends. I thought that I would lose influence. And here I am in the pulpit every Sunday telling everybody, hold strong, stay strong, have courage. And in my heart, I was saying, give up, don't show up, don't come outside, don't preach. You're not worthy. God doesn't love you. You're not strong enough. You're a failure. This is the message that's going on in my mind. And then it was the moment that I recognized that in the meantime is a mean time. I was in the meantime. I was waiting on my breakthrough. I was waiting on a brighter day. I was actually waiting on my messages to become true in my life. And for 6 months, I didn't hear God. For 6 months, I struggled to pray. For 6 months, I struggled to preach. For 6 months, I studied and I heard nothing. And people were telling me that my messages were getting better. And then that's when I recognized that I was in a shift, that perhaps in the first half of my ministry, I was relying on my theological abilities. But in the second half, I was relying on the power of God and the vulnerability of being broken. And like Paul said, I am of all sinners the chief. And I had to handle that shift. And I had to study and I had to pray and I cried and I deliberated and I wrote and I just depended on people like you who continued to be there with me. And so when I say shift, I want people to understand that there are two sides to the story. But here it is. I'm in this stony, rocky, rigid, hard place. And I didn't recognize that God was chipping at me. And as Michelangelo said, in every block of stone is a statue. And I didn't realize that God was using all of that to get the statue out of the block, to get the handiwork out of the man. I was building a church and I didn't know God was building a man. I got in touch with my emotions. I learned how to cry. All of that tough guy stuff, I let it go. I learned how to acquiesce. I learned how to be humble. I learned how to operate under fear. I couldn't tell you how much I learned in that shift. I wish I could have learned it in a book. I wish I could have learned it in theological school. But some people have to understand that we learn in struggle. And I am an experiential learner, and I learned in those moments. So it was the biggest shift of my life. But after I come through this, like Job, I felt God saying, it's all necessary. You're going to come through like pure gold. So it makes me emotional to talk about it. But I figured that it's better for me to tell the body of Christ that God can still use you, because if he can still use me, he can use anybody. And I could stand before the people and pretend like nothing has ever gone wrong. Or I can tell the people, yeah, God really does have grace. Because our church has grown. What church in America, in the world, grows after you go through a moment like that? What person still gets an opportunity to preach at your conference after a situation like that? What person gets an opportunity to write a book and it be #1 in America for Christian books in the first week? I can't take credit for it. Only God could do it.
Wow. Wow.
But God can still use you guys. I just want you to, I just encourage all of your followers just to type that God can still use me, because if he can use me, he can use anybody.
Such a powerful story. All right. I didn't know this thing was going to be this powerful. I didn't know it was going to be this deep, man. All right. How did you know that it was time for you to shift? Because, I mean, people could go through things and not make a shift. All right. And they just stagnant in it. So how did you know that it was time to make a shift?
I sincerely believe that if you have tried something for long enough and you have not seen some sort of advancement, it's time to shift. I do business, and one of the things I encourage our business people is if your business hasn't had a moment of success in the first 3 to 5 years, either you're in the wrong business or you're the wrong person in that business. That everything that we see God do in the scripture, he does it immediately, straightway, straightforward. I think that the ramifications of a lack of success or results is one of the indicators that you need to shift. You know, I've come to Nigeria because of you and other friends several times. I've been to Africa more than I have fingers on both of my hands. And I've been there so much that I know a little bit about the history. And I did my ancestry and found out that I am at least 40% Nigerian. So no wonder I feel at home when I get there amongst the people. And I realize, you know, I remember reading somewhere that in 1966, the regime had changed there from parliament to military dictatorship, and then after 20 years of democracy had given democracy back to the people. And now, you know, back in 1999 when I graduated high school, the gross domestic product of Nigeria was about 59 billion. Now in 2020, you're talking about $400 billion in gross domestic product. Look at that shift. Look at the veracity of that growth, because somebody in Nigeria said, you know what? We've been doing the same thing for so long, but there's no growth. We've been doing the same thing for so long, but there was no advancement. And then somebody put their life on the line and stepped out there and said, you know what, we're going to take the power back to the people. And when the power got back to the people, look at how 6 times your economy has grown 6 times in the last 40 to 50 years. That's how you know that you're supposed to initiate a shift. You've been on this hamster wheel and things have been the same size year after year. You've been in the same situation year after year. You've been in the same circle of friends year after year. You've been going to the same church year after year, and you haven't grown spiritually. You've had the same pastor since you were 15 year after year, and then somebody steps out of that and steps in the church of a Pastor Poju, and in 6 months their life blossoms, and more happens under 6 months of your sermons than 8 years at somebody. That's how you know that you're supposed to initiate a shift, because you, my friend, are too powerful. My brother, my sister, you are too powerful to be in any situation for a long period of time and not see a shift. You are the handiwork of God. You were created by Christ in his image. How can you be created by God and be in his image and be an heir and a joint heir of a God who owns everything and not see growth in your life? It is the Father's good pleasure that you would see and enjoy the benefits of the kingdom. I believe that every Christian, not some of us, not most of us, every one of us in this earthen vessel has been placed a gift that if we shift right, we will find that inside of us there is a treasure. So there's a story, Pastor, about over in Singapore about there being this 50-foot statue. And it was a religious statue to one of the religions over there, and it was made out of rock and clay and mud, right? So it's sitting there. It's 50 feet tall. Can you imagine how heavy it is? It's so heavy that they have to get earth movers to move it from this place. And now, why are they moving it? Because the government has now implemented eminent domain, and they're getting ready to take a freeway right through the place where this statue sits. And so the people are saying, no, it's a religious thing. You can't move it. Don't move it. It belongs to us. It is our God. It is our image. They say, don't move it. The government says, we don't care. We have eminent domain. It has to be moved. They were arguing about it. This statue was appraised at $50,000 US. In that economy, it was way more money. But calculated in American dollars, it was about 50,000. Pastor, do you know when they picked that statue up, and they hooked it up to the earth movers, and they began to shift it from where it was to the next place, all of a sudden it starts to shake and it starts to break. And the story is that the scales and the mud and the brick starts to fall off of it. And they recognize after they start shifting it that the entire statue was made of solid gold. As long as it would have stood still, it was worth $50,000 of rock and an image. But when they moved it, they found out that it was gold underneath. And let me tell you, that is why God shifts you, because there was something underneath that surface. There was something underneath There is something inside of you that nobody knows. And guess what? You don't even know it. So that's why God shakes you. That's why he breaks you. That's why he is the potter and we are the clay. That's why he molds us. And remember, the potter had the clay on the wheel and then he threw it down and said, you know what? I've got to make it anew. And that's where you are right now. That's God is taking you off of that wheel and throwing you down and making you anew. And you may feel like it's a breaking, but God says it's a shifting, because underneath that attitude, underneath that rejection, underneath that pain, underneath that disposition is a solid gold saint. And I decree and declare that every person who's watching, there is so much more to you. But sometimes God has to initiate a shift to get to it.
Amen. Two things. First of all, I can hear my wife upstairs. She's shouting. I think she's having church listening to you. Because I can hear her shouting. What's going on? She must be shouting at the preaching upstairs. Second thing I must tell you is that the protocol officers always told me when he came to preach that this man, Pastor Keion, must be a Nigerian by DNA because of the sense of fashion. So when you said you're 40% Nigerian, I'm sure they'll be saying where they are.
All right. I'm proud of it. I'm proud of it.
All right. Then in hindsight, is there a time you think you should have shifted, but you stagnated, which means you didn't make the shift that you thought you should have?
Man, yes. Absolutely. I have to go back to what we just talked about with my marriage. Had I was so focused on trying to build a church, and I was gone. I mean, I was preaching everywhere all the time. And I didn't realize that you cannot go after a thing without losing a thing. It's not if you don't do it unintelligently. I learned that this is what most of us don't do, and I can speak for myself, that we don't consider that in order to get a thing, grab a thing, you have to let go of the thing that you're holding.
Yeah.
That we're always excited about where we're going to, but we never consider what we have to leave behind to go get it. I wish I would have sat my children and wife down, well, my daughter, I have one daughter. I wish I could have sat them down 10 years ago and told them that this was going to cost more than I knew, that I would work long hours and that I would be absent, and that I was struggling to be emotionally attached, because I felt like since I had gone out and preached and I'd given all of my virtue, I would be frustrated because I didn't feel that in return. I should have shifted then. I can also think of a time I should not have, that I should have shifted in ministry. I remember I was in a school, our church was in a school. It was in a middle school, Pastor, and that middle school sat about 400 people. And we had gone in there, and our church had grown. We had 800 people to join our church in 16 weeks. Wow. By the time our church was 5 months old, we had already had 1,000 members.
Wow.
By the time we were 5 years old, we had already had 6,000 members. And by the time we were 10 years old, we had already had nearly 12,000 members. And the church was growing at a rate of about 1,100 to 1,200 people a year. But I made a great mistake, because when we were in the middle school, I was just excited that we had all these people. And I left a place of growth, trying to go to a bigger place so that I could fit all of the people in. And I didn't realize that it is a tragedy to grow the building before you grow the people. And that we went off and we got a larger place, but the people were not coming because I hadn't yet discipled them. 16 weeks, 1,000 people, they didn't know me, I didn't know them. I was just on this trajectory, and I was leaving everything behind, and I was going and going and shifting and building, trying to run away from my past, because I grew up in poverty, and my mother made $7 an hour and raised 4 people, and we were broken, We had rodents in the house, and we had rats and mice, and we had all of that kind of stuff, and I was just trying to be successful so that I could go back and grab everybody and show them that I was successful. And I was making shifts and decisions prematurely. And when you shift a thing that is not strong, and when you shift a thing that is not enforced, and if you try to build a house in a hurricane, you will find out that it is more difficult than you think. So I can think of a few times that I shifted when I shouldn't have. And I can think of a few times where I moved and I didn't make sure that everything that was with me was ready to move. It would be like you deciding right now you're going to move, and while your wife, who by the way is one of my favorite people in the world, and so everybody knows she is the reason that Pastor and I know each other, because she liked me first. So let's just get it out there. Could you imagine deciding you were going to shift right now and move, and you didn't go upstairs and tell her, and she came downstairs and you were gone? Could you imagine? It would be the best decision you ever made. Maybe you found a house that was 100% paid for, and you had all the equity in it. And if you moved in it today, somebody was going to buy it from you tomorrow. And the government said there was diamonds underneath the house and there was oil underneath the house. And you made the right move because it was the greatest financial decision that you had ever made. But you failed to walk up a few steps and inform your wife that you were moving, and she came down and you were gone. It wouldn't be a great shift, because it would be the failure of communicating and preparing all of that is with you, that we're moving for this purpose. I have done that one too many times in my life, and I'm almost 39 now. And I wish I would have learned this lesson earlier and not been so zealous and aggressive about goals, because when you go to a thing, you have to also consider what it'll cost you on the way.
Wow. Whew. Yeah. All right. We're just going to have one last question before I just. What advice will you share with the world tonight? People who resonate, and I can see from all the comments that a lot of people are really resonating with this. So, what one advice will you share with the world tonight?
I remember a pastor walked up to me and he said to me, "You're new to this city." And he said, "There is a hierarchy here, and you need to respect that." And he looked me in my face and he said, "Who do you think you are?"
What?
I wish he would have asked me that question within the last year, because I didn't have the answer 10 years ago when he asked me. He asked me and I didn't know. If he would have asked me today, I would have said, "I'm the head and not the tail. I'm above only and never beneath. I am the lender and not the borrower." If I had one thing to tell all of the listeners today, you better know who you are. You better know who you are. You better know who you are, because when you know who you are, nobody can take it from you. When you know who you are, nobody can define you. When you know who you are, you don't stay up all night contemplating other people's opinions about you, and you don't lose sleep at night because you're concerned about somebody's assessment of you. You have to know. The greatest thing that has ever happened to me in the last year is I finally met myself. I finally met myself. And I hope and I pray that out of my nakedness and exposing myself and putting myself at great harm for people to make their own assessments about what I've said today, if I can encourage you just to know who you are, to be able to know who God created you to be, this book, these tears and this pain would be worth the call to ministry if I can get you to know who you are and whose you are. That's what I'll leave it at.
Thank you, Pastor Keion. I must say something. All right. I must say two things I'm going to say. Number one, I have never in my entire life, heard a minister of God so open about their personal struggles. I've not even heard anything close to this that I heard tonight. And I think this is the best conversation I've had in my life.
Wow.
I actually think this is the best conversation. All right. I had no idea that we were going to get this deep. But it's always good, all right, to be precise about things. So I'm going to have to let go. But let me just tell the public, all right, particularly those of us who are in Nigeria, the audience in Nigeria, please, I'm sure you will be itching to get this book. You can get it on Amazon. It's called Shift, all right. Keion Henderson, it has, there are 12 chapters: death, divorce. Next one, he speaks on desperation. Third, he speaks on decision. Fourth, he speaks on deliverance. Fifth, he speaks on destiny. Six, he speaks on direction. Seven, he speaks on development. Eight, he speaks on determination. Nine, he speaks on disappointment. 10, he speaks on disclosure and declaration. 11, he speaks on documentation. And 12, on dominion. I'm sure you will want to get this. So go on Amazon there, Keion Henderson, Shift, and please order this book. I cannot, every time I meet with you, you've grown significantly. The anointing that came out from this broadcast here, unusual stuff. So we can't wait to have you back at WAFTEC 2021, right? We can't, I'm sure, but we can't wait to have you back. Okay? My wife was telling me this evening, just before we came on. She said, look, he's a man that is going places, and I actually consider it an honor and a privilege that I met you and I can call you a friend. Thank you very much for coming on this podcast.
I love you, Pastor. Thank you so much.
Thank you, man. Thank you so much. God bless you, man.